computer. Okay. Let's pray. Father, once again, we want to give thanks to you and for a wonderful day, a day, Lord, that you have created, made for us, that we will work, we enjoyed, and we delight in, and because it is the day you have created for all of us. We ask you, Lord, this evening, and as we take the time and to study your word, and perhaps to reflect and meditate upon your word, and we received the blessings that accrue from it. We ask you, Lord, that you help us not just be hearers of your word, but also be doers of your word. Help us, Lord, to be discerning. Help us, Lord, not to hear just what the word says, but also what the Spirit speaks to us through your word. So we commit ourselves to you. We commit this session to your hands. May your blessing be upon all of us as we learned, as we seek to understand your word better. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Okay. This is going to be our second last session next Wednesday, and we will then wrap it up with the finals and session on Psalms. Then we will take a break, and we come back. We will look at the New Testament book. There's a suggestion that we look at the Gospel of John. Just now, then this came up, and so it's not confirmed. Maybe you'll make yourselves heard and see whether you like us to look at the Gospel of John, or you like to look at some other book in the New Testament. Okay, so so tonight we look at Wisdom Psalms. By way of introduction, there is widespread agreement among Old Testament scholars. There's a category of psalm that have some kind of relationship or kinship with the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible. Wisdom literature, we're talking about Proverbs, we're talking about Job, we're talking about Ecclesiastes, we're talking about the Song of Solomon, and many times Psalms is also listed as a part of wisdom literature, although it is not altogether accurate. And I think the most accurate way is look at Psalms and wisdom literature. But there is a relationship between Psalms and wisdom literature in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. All right. Now, this is another group that is not defined by structure, by literary form. The criteria used to define which psalms should be included are such things as the presence of ideas, of linguistic, stylistic features that are characteristic of wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible, or of Israelite or ancient Middle East and ancient Near East. So this is the criteria that cause and scholars to consider what are wisdom psalms. Okay, but there is considerable disagreement that arises because of the difficulty in deciding how many wisdom characteristics a psalm must have in order to be classified as a wisdom psalm. Just because I have one idea about wisdom, the idea, does that make a wisdom psalm? Some says no. And so how many? 2 or 3 or 4? So quite a few scholars have questioned whether wisdom psalms is valuable as a category. And that is some questions, but I take the value that there are psalms that are called wisdom psalms. Now, the following And Psalms appear in most lists of wisdom Psalms. And most scholars who talk about wisdom Psalms will consider Psalms 1, Psalm 34, Psalm 37, Psalm 49, Psalm 73, Psalm 111, Psalm 112. Of course, some lists are longer, and some are probably disputed category, all called and Psalms that are considered as wisdom Psalms. Okay. Now, what these have in common is that the poet is addressing the question of the meaning of life, and in particular, the problem of the prosperity of the wicked and the suffering of the righteous. Why do the wicked prosper? Why do the righteous suffer? And they also make use of words and phrases that's found in wisdom literature, and in wisdom. Okay, all right. Now, some scholars have argued that these psalms were never actually used in worship. They regard them as reflective, as didactic poems, basically teaching poems and reflective poems, wisdom poems that were used in a teaching setting, separated from worship. Okay, and there is whether it's a palace school, whether it is the Levitical school, and this is some that are used in what we call in teaching setting rather than in a temple worship. However, if that's so, is then not clear why they're included in the Psalter, in the book of Psalms? If they are teaching and are not used for worship, then why are they here? And nor is it clear that why the material of this psalm should not sometimes have a place found in worship. Why can't it be and in worship as well? Okay, and worship and the psalms can be used and can be sung and as a teaching tool. Worship doesn't necessarily need to be then just praising God, thanking God, confessing. Worship can also have a teaching value. And Martin Luther saw the importance of hymns as a teaching tool. My theology professor at Fuller and once told us that if you really want to know what the people in the church believe in, what they really find important, look at the songs and the hymns that they sing. And not the theology books, not the Sunday school lessons, not even the preaching. What they sing and what they express in hymns is more reflective of what they really believe. And so I think there's something to be said about that. Okay, so that is Wisdom Psalms. Okay, today I like to look at the most common and most familiar psalm, known as a Wisdom Psalm, Psalm 1. I think this is a very familiar psalm to most of us. If you start reading the Psalms, probably you look at Psalm 1. And I then debated whether I should have taken a more less known psalm rather than take a Psalm 1 which are familiar. But I don't think Psalm 1 has been used for preaching as much as Psalm 23 or some of the other Psalms. And Psalm 1, I think we can still learn something even though we are very familiar with it. Okay. All right. Now, the first thing that probably most people don't realize or may not note, that Psalm 1, we can title this as the way of the righteous. Psalm 1 serves, along with Psalm 2, as a first part of a two-part introduction to the book of Psalms. It's quite deliberate. Its placement is intentional on the part of the editors and the people that responsible for final form of the book. Probably much earlier, there were collection of psalms, collection of hymns. There what we call various, what we call, just like today, then there is Hillsong, there is elevation music, there is an Maranatha. There are different groups of people who put down what we call songs, and then someone comes along and want to put a kind of definitive song book for the church and for all Christians or all Pentecostals or whatever it is want to put it. And what do you do when what song that you want to put? So if you look in that way, there were various collections, the songs and the songs of Asaph, the songs of David, the songs of Korah, there are songs of Moses and all that. So we want to put it into a final book, and that they will be used and by the people of God in temple worship or at home or in small community. What do you do as a first psalm? So Psalm 1 and Psalm 2, and I think serves as a first part or as a two-part introduction to the psalm, to the book of Psalms. Its placement, I think, is very intentional, very deliberate on the part of the people, the scribes. They're responsible for the final form of the book of Psalms. Psalm 1 cites the Torah obedience as the requirement to entry into literary sanctuary of the book. If you consider Psalms as a worship book, maybe you look at a Psalms as a kind of a worship setting. Psalms is like the literary temple, literary sanctuary. And how do you get who is qualified to come to the temple to worship? Who is worthy to come to use the book of Psalms as a form, as a way to worship God? And Psalm 1 acts and cites the requirement, the prerequisite, the primary entry and a pass, and is Torah obedience, obedience to the law. And then Psalm 2, after Psalm 1, presents the worshiper, the entrant, with a powerful depiction of God and his anointed, and he has strength over against the plotting of the earth's powerful leaders. So Psalm 1, Psalm 2 go hand in hand. First, there is the prerequisite of the Torah, and you want to worship God, you must obey the Torah, you must obey God's laws. And then Psalm 2 tells you, as you come to worship, you'll come to worship a powerful God who has set his Messiah, his anointed one, over against the wicked world. So we're not going to do Psalm 2, and so today we're going to do Psalm 1. All right. Psalm 2 is a royal psalm, kingship psalm. Now, the first psalm focus is on Torah obedience, and it differentiates those who delight in the Lord and those who are, the psalmist called the wicked. Okay, and the reader naturally would identify with one or the other. With a subtle message, doesn't come, but it is a kind of clear but subtle message that those who are wicked should go no further into the literary sanctuary of the Psalms. So this is the immigration desk. You want this the border control. This is the place, and you come. And if you are not the righteous, you are not the people who follow, who obey the law, you stop here, you cannot go any further. And so the wicked are not allowed and should go any further into the literary sanctuary of the Psalms. So Psalm 1 serves in this particular capacity. You want to worship God, you want to use the Psalms, you want to sing the Psalms, you need to be one who meditate upon the law. All right. So after all, like the physical sanctuary, the literary sanctuary presumes an intimacy and with God that only the righteous can experience. So Psalm 1 stands like a Levitical gatekeeper, like the priest who stands there, warning the wicked to proceed no further. That's how Psalm 1 functions, and in the overall canonical context of the book of the Psalms. And this is probably the most important lesson, the most important thing that I want to get through across to each one of you. Probably many have not heard this. Yeah, you use the Psalms and all that, but Psalm 1 serves a very important purpose. It is the gateway, it is the gatekeeper to the book of Psalms. If you don't fulfill the requirement of the Psalms is not for you. You cannot go any further. You stop right there. All right. One Old Testament scholar, I think it was Brueggemann, who points out that Psalms 1's initial positions demonstrates that the prayers of the Psalm of the Psalter are grounded and depend upon Torah piety and obedience. This is basic, and you can't sing, you can't worship unless you obey the Torah, and your piety is determined by the Torah. This is an Old Testament context, okay? This is in the Old Testament, and in many ways also can be transposed into the Christian as well, okay? Of course, now Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, a new law I give to you, and we have that. The Psalm employs concepts, themes, terminology of wisdom literature, and therefore then we rightly understand it as a wisdom psalm, wisdom poem, okay? And so in that, most notably, like the book of Proverbs, it makes a clear distinction, clear delineation between the righteous and the wicked. And the righteous connect them with great blessings, and the latter with dire consequences. So this is its connection with the book of Proverbs. Okay. Now the psalm has 3 stanzas. The first stanza describes the blessings that come upon those who are righteous, while the second presents the contrasting destiny of the wicked. And then the final stanza provides a summary statement concerning both the righteous and the wicked. In this sense, I think that I think the NIV, then the paragraphing is, I think, more clear and better than the ESV, and ESV try to make it more consistent in that, and not so what we call uneven in the number of verses, number of words. But I think the concepts are much more important. And so verse 1 to 3, and then verse 4 to 5, and then verse 6, and the last, and part of it, okay? First of all, verse 1 to 3. Blessed is the one, or blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. He meditates on the Lord day and night. He's like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in the season. His leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. In all he does, he prospers. So the psalm, verse 1, opens with what I call a tricolon, and 3 lines. Okay, a colon is a line, and in Hebrew there's a line, and this is a technical Old Testament academic structure or term. A psalm, a verse can be what we call bicolon or tricolon or a quadcolon, and whether it is 2 colon, then 3 colon, or 4 colons. Here the psalm opens with a tricolon, okay? And that pronounces blessing on people who distances themselves and who distance themselves from evil, and people who keep away and who doesn't do these things. Now, as typical with what we call parallelism, each colon adds to the thought of the first colon. So first colon is A, then what's more, B, and what's more, C. All right. So colon A says this, then you want to add something to it, then B, and then you add more to it, C. So it is kind of a step what we call step ladder kind of a progression. So one leads further to the next. Okay, it adds to it. It just doesn't just repeat the same. Yes, it says the same, roughly the same thing, but with more intensification. All right. So the first colon describes one who does not walk in step with the wicked. Okay. Now to walk is associated with them not as deeply as to stand with them or to sit with them. And the first sermon that I ever heard and in a Pentecostal church is this sermon that's adapted from Watchman Nee and walk and stand and sit. It is a kind of very interesting progression. We tend to say we sit and then we stand and then we walk, but the psalmist says no. Okay, it is kind of the person who walks is a person that he's leisurely walking. He doesn't walk in step with the wicked. He's going his way. Then he stands. He stops, and he settles down in that position. He stands, and it is like you're walking with a group of people. You just casually or just relatively and leisurely. Then you stand. You protest and you wave your placards and you make your stand and then if that doesn't work, you sit down. Basically, what we call and the protesters have got to sit in. We will not be moved. If you're standing, they can push you away, but you sit down, they have to carry you away. And so it is. And so the first column is that he doesn't walk in the counsel of the wicked. He doesn't stand in the way of sinners. He doesn't sit and in the seat of scoffers or in the company, or doesn't walk and in step with the wicked, doesn't stand in the way of the sinner's take. He doesn't sit in the company of mockers. Okay, that's the NIV version. Now, each colon, each line intensifies the relationship with evil and uses more forceful terms for evil. So first the wicked, then sinners, then the mockers. The mockers are the most egregiously evil, shockingly evil, and egregiously very shocking and evil people, since they not only sin, but they turn around and mock the innocent. So then the mockers, and so the wicked, the sinners, and the mockers, and so he doesn't do that. Okay. So the psalmist pronounces those who avoid such evil associations as blessed. Blessed. Blessed is the one. Blessed is the man. Now, the Hebrew term used by the psalmist is asher. The one that you see in apostrophe, that is the Hebrew. That is what we call stands for the Hebrew consonant, Hebrew letter aleph. Which is basically silent, and of course, a consonant and has no sound. You need what we call to supply a vowel. So it's asher. Asher stresses the state of happiness. Now, asher is not to be treated as a strict synonym for another word. There's also then translated as blessed, Baruch, Barakah, and it's blessed. Baruch means more of being empowered or favored as the recipient of the blessing of the Lord. Okay, and so sometimes I have this then kind of thing in my mind when we have in what we call the wedding, we Chinese say yam sing, and so when they say, right, we don't want to say yam sing, we say blessing. So I kind of play around playfully, say, are you saying Asher or are you saying Baruch? And if Asher blessing is happiness, and is yam sing, and if Baruch is to be blessed by God, and to ask for God's blessing, then so there are two different words. In English, we translate the same way. In New Testament, there's also this, and so in the book of Matthew, and blessed and are the poor, that is Makarios, Makaroi, which is a translation for Asher. Then blessed is the one who there's Baruch, praise be the one that is eugelatos, to be blessed by God. Two different words actually. However, that's having said that, we can say that the two words do overlap, in that the one and who is blessed, Baruch, and may respond by being happy, Asher. So some translations and cause some Christians to be unhappy with it. I think the Good News Bible says that happy is the one. That's a good translation, actually. Happy. There is a good biblical understanding of happy, to be joyful, and to the state of happiness, and to be wholeheartedly glad. Okay. I posted a video and on the chat group, different perspective. Asher is something that people may say about you. Baruch is something that you'll say about God, and that God blessed you. Okay, and that is the difference. Okay, so in Psalm 1, the one who obeys God's law is happy. Okay, in Deuteronomy 28, covenant obedience leads to blessing, ha-barakut, and to the blessing of God. So Deuteronomy 28, and so Psalm 1 talks about happiness, and the one who then obeys God's law and God's covenant is happy. In Deuteronomy, and if you obey the covenant, it leads to God's blessing. And so two complementary, somehow different way, but not altogether completely different. They kind of overlap as well. Okay. So while verse 1 states the negative requirements for righteousness and resulted blessing, the avoidance of evil, to don't walk in the counsel of the wicked, don't stand in the way of sinners, don't sit in the seat of scoffers or mockers. And verse 2 gives the positive description of the righteous person. The righteous who are blessed, who are happy, delight in the law of the Lord. Okay, the one who is Asher, who is happy, and delight in the law of the Lord. Now, there is some kind of ambiguity as to what is meant by Torah here, the law. It could be the Ten Commandments, and also the 613 laws that follow them, all the laws, all the commandments in the Old Testament. It could mean the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. It could refer to the book of Deuteronomy. This is sometimes called the book of the law. We are talking about Psalms, okay, the psalmists, and the context of the Old Testament, the writers of the Psalm and all the psalmists, and put that way. So what is he referring to? And possibly then based on Deuteronomy 27, 28, where blessing is contingent on following the covenant law, it seems probably best to understand the reference is to delight in obedience to the divine requirements that God has given to the covenant. You are a people of the covenant, people of the old covenant, or people of the new covenant. It is best to refer to those who delight in obedience to God's divine requirements. Okay. Then verse 3, and figuratively, metaphorically depicts the vibrant condition of the person who avoids evil and embraces righteous obedience. So, and what is he like? He is like a tree planted by the streams of water. Okay, very vibrant, very luxuriant, very beautiful picture of a tree. Now, technically, then this is a simile, and he is like a tree. To unpack this figure, some sees in references to the Garden of Eden, and where there is what we call the tree of life, and trees, and so trees suggest life and productivity, fruitfulness, health, and all that. And the final column says that whatever they do prospers and breaks out and of that image and states, just as a well-watered tree produces fruit, so the righteous person will prosper, will be fruitful, will be an prosperous person in that so. One maybe can think of Joseph, and in the Old Testament examples, and as one whose very presence and in the household of Potiphar, or even in later Egypt prison, caused those places to be fruitful. So even in Potiphar's house, because Joseph and delights in God and obedience to God, he God prospers him, not only his house, but also the household of Potiphar. And even in Egypt prison, then the prison become a more even and humane way, that in such a way that the jail, the warden made Joseph in charge of the prison, then the prison becomes a better place, a fruitful place, because God was with him. Okay, and God prospers him even in the most unlikely of places. Then verse 4, very abruptly, and punishment of the wicked turns from the rewards of righteousness to the punishment of the wicked, and very, very dramatically, not so the wicked. Okay, and I think, and again, I like the NIV, the way it is. The ESV tends to be a little bit tame. They say the wicked are not so, not so the wicked, and an exclamation mark. And so I think that is score 1 for NIV over the ESV. Okay. While the righteous are a well-watered tree, a tree that blossoms, that is fruitful, that provides shade, that provides fruit, and the chaff, okay, they are like the chaff. It's the very opposite of a tree, okay, and while the tree has abundance of live-giving water, the chaff is dry. The tree is deep-rooted, is productive. The chaff has no connection to the earth, and is blown, rolls away as the wind blows it, and is useless. So the wicked, not so. They are not like a tree. They're not even like a plant. They're not even like weeds. They are like chaff that are blown away, that the wind drives away. Yeah, completely useless and no value whatsoever. As a result, the wicked will not survive God's judgment. Now, it's not clear precisely what is meant by judgment here. Is it talking about future judgment, judgment day? They will not survive. And well, remember this Old Testament. This is about Psalms. This is not New Testament. And in New Testament, we can talk about the final judgment, the judgment of Christ, and the judgment of God. But here we're talking about Psalm used by the psalmist, used by the people of God in the Old Testament way. That's quite ahead. And so in the Old Testament context, especially if you think it's earlier, It may simply refer to the moment in this life when God brings consequences on people for their wicked actions. So then in Old Testament, then people don't wait until they die before they experience God's judgment. People then will experience God's judgment in this life. That's how they see it, and judgment comes on this life. And later on, you find that later wisdom literature struggle with that because some people seems to have an escaped and the judgment of God, and the wisdom literature struggles with that, the problem of theodicy. Why do the wicked prosper? Okay. And after all, we can say the full-blown teaching of the afterlife comes only with clarity in the New Testament. So very careful when you study Old Testament, New Testament, and the Old Testament, you have to try to understand the Old Testament within its context, and try not to read New Testament ideas into the Old Testament. In application, yes, the Old Testament will finally point to the New Testament, but you want to understand the Old Testament with itself, how the people in the Old Testament understood or understands or reads that, you need to put that, keep that in mind. So the idea of the resurrection, the idea of the punishment after death, and Old Testament is quite and not that developed idea yet. And everything in this life is contained in this life. And so if you're a good person, God prospers you. If you're a person, God punishes you in this life. However, one may argue that Psalm 1 was not only placed an initial book in the Psalter during the post-exilic period, where some of these ideas are beginning then of the afterlife judgment beginning to come into prominence or into play. And but Psalm 1 could also have been written and around this time as well. So judgment afterlife is not altogether impossible idea, although we must probably be careful not to read too much into it. And there is still that hope or that possibility or that expectation that even those who died, escape judgment of God, will experience some kind of judgment in the afterlife. All right. So Psalm 1, and it's probably yeah, you cannot think of the book of Psalms that Psalm 1 is the first psalm to be written, and then that's not how people do books. Okay, if you know about writing, about authors, the introduction, the preface is usually the last section to be written. And whether it's a novel, whether it is what we call a thesis, whether it is a textbook, and usually after the whole book is completed, after the whole thing is completed, then the writer usually introduces his subject into the introduction. So the introduction is something that you read first, but usually the last to be written, the final to be written. And I think that that you should bear in mind. And if you're those who are and aspiring to be writers, you will find that this is what they will teach you. Don't start with introduction first, because that is okay. Start and somewhere and at the very beginning, but the introduction proper is something that you do when your final story, when your final thesis, when your final textbook writing has been completed. Okay. So if that is so, some late Old Testament as well as some Jewish, that second temple, when I talk about the second temple, we're talking about a temple that was rebuilt after the Babylonian captivity. The first temple is Solomon's temple. Then the second temple is a temple that is been built. So when they came back from exile, so we call it second temple period, second temple Jews. They did have a more sophisticated understanding than about the afterlife. So so they become, we find books that are written after the exile and after or post-exile period seems to indicate more of the resurrection and the death and judgment in the afterlife. Okay. Now the second column and of this doesn't really understand what we call and settle the question about and what this judgment is. Okay, then the wicked shall not stand in the judgment, nor the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. But it does make clear that God doesn't confuse the righteous with the wicked, and each, okay, and will receive the proper due. But it also indicates that the wicked will not stand in the congregation, okay, which is a setting for the use of the psalm in worship. So the wicked has no place when we come to worship God. So Psalm 1 clearly disqualifies the wicked for what we call the privilege of worshiping God. Okay, they have no place in the congregation of the righteous. Okay, the two ways, verse 5 and verse 6. Okay, wisdom literature and a kind of recognizes everyone has walking on the path or the way. That way is either the way of wisdom, the righteousness that that is straight, well lit, and smooth, leads to life, or the way is crooked and leads to obstacles and leads to death. Okay, and positive side of the psalmist here is similar to the idea in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 to 6, and in some, I know some of you, and this is your favorite and verse, and one of the favorite verses that you memorize. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on understanding in all your paths. Acknowledge him or know him, and he will keep your paths straight. So trust in Yahweh with all your heart. Don't depend on understanding in all your paths. Know him, acknowledge him, and he will keep your paths straight. So the psalmist's statement is and expressed in this way: the Lord knows the way of the righteous. Okay. The fact that the Lord watches over the righteous means that they will be safe. And while the psalmist concludes with a warning that the way of the wicked will end in destruction, whether in this life or whether in the afterlife. Okay. Now, how does it mean for us? Psalm 1 introduces the Psalter. This is a book of Psalms, and we use the word Psalter as the book of Psalms. And by contrasting the righteous and the wicked, the righteous are those who delight in God's law and spend considerable time studying it. To meditate is another way to study it, to reflect upon it, to think about it, and reflect upon it, to meditate upon it, and recite it. And often, the righteous will prosper, the wicked will perish. Jeremiah 17, verse 5 to 8, utilizes the same imagery of the flourishing tree to describe the person who trusts in God. Walter Brueggemann highlights the significance of Psalm 1 as the opening poem where it observes, standing at the beginning of the Psalter, this psalm intends that all psalms should be read through the prism of Torah obedience and to obey the law, the Torah. Okay, we'll speak more about Torah and in the next week when we talk about Torah psalms. Okay, and this psalm basically calls the faithful to obedience, to obey the law. Okay, now the New Testament recognizes and Jesus as the only righteous person without exception. He follows the Father's will perfectly, even though it ultimately leads him to the cross. Okay, so Psalm 1, you can say, is the one who describes, Psalm 1 describes, who describes Jesus, who follows God, and of course, he doesn't perish. Even though he died on the cross, the Lord brought him, resurrected him in victory from the dead. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, we have Evan Koo. I'm not too sure who Evan Koo is. Maybe you can introduce yourself.